There exists a place between the objective and the subjective. It's called the historical. The historical is the objective course of objective and subjective events, or in other words, using history as methodology. If you were to take a work of literature from the modern day and show it to people from 50 BC, they would not be able to appreciate it. It's outside of its historical context. To those without an understanding of the modern day, the work just won't mean that much. Imagine Shakespeare without the Bible. Imagine the Aeneid without the Iliad and the Odyssey. Imagine Frankenstein, or the entire English canon for that matter, without Paradise Lost. And if you want the most extreme example of all, try reading a work of literature in a language you don't understand. This all means that to have good taste means to be knowledgeable about a history and to have good judgment when applying it. It's within this realm of the historical where we find fashion. So you can call me Ezekiel. And this is the aesthetics of fashion. Fashion is when an individual uses a combination of visual and inhabited methods to display themselves to the world. This means that fashion is not a craft like the visual or literary arts, but a practice like a performing art. Any act of fashion can only exist once. It can be imitated, but it can never be replicated. Fashion certainly includes clothing and jewelry, but it also includes the way you walk and carry yourself, the language and dialect you speak, the subjects you talk about, the places you can be found in, the people you can be found with, and so on. More broadly, fashion is the state in which a man or woman is doing three things. Fashion is when you try to make people look at you while conveying information about yourself and are doing both of these things without being gauche. To practice fashion, you must be making an attempt to accomplish the first two goals. To practice good fashion, you must not violate the conditions of the third. If you're trying to make people look at you, but not convey information about yourself, but of, say, a product, you're not participating in fashion. You're an advertisement. Advertising can be an element of fashion, but it cannot be the primary function. If you do it while being gauche, you might be something particularly silly like a promotional model. People will certainly be looking at you, and will be finding out about your product, but you're probably not going to be thought of as very fashionable. If you're trying to convey information about yourself without trying to be looked at, you're most likely wearing a uniform. And uniforms are designed to look, well, uniform. You're not supposed to stand out, but people will know exactly what you are. And finally, if you're neither trying to get people to look at you, nor convey information about yourself, then you're probably not wearing any clothes at all. In which case, put some pants on, you cretin! So, what actually makes for good fashion? Well, it's historical, so to find out what good fashion is, we should first understand how the historical works. There are two types of historical factors: objective, which means from nature, and subjective, which means from man. These often correlate to evolutionary pressures. At the beginning of any history, objective factors dominate. Environmental selection is in control. If something doesn't work, it'll die. If it does work, it'll survive and propagate. Extinct species were beaten out by existing ones because they were not as able to survive in their environment as their replacements. Or at least that's one cause of extinction. We'll talk about the other way in a bit. But first, I want you to imagine the ancient Egyptians and the ancient Nords. What clothes are they wearing? It's probably obvious. The Nords are wearing pants, tops with long sleeves, layers, as many as they can to avoid the cold. The women may wear skirts, but they're probably long and they're certainly going to wear something around their legs too. How about the ancient Egyptians? They're wearing light, loose-fitting clothes. The men may not wear tops at all. This should all require very little explanation. The environment these societies developed in, objective factors, have demanded that they wear the clothes they do. An Egyptian dressed as a Nord would die from heat, and a Nord dressed as an Egyptian would freeze. But man wants more than to just survive. He wants to reproduce. When trying to attract a partner, an individual can try to do everything in their power to be the best survivor around. After all, who wouldn't want a great survivor as their offspring? But that's hard. There's a much easier option. You can bluff. It's here that the subjective enters history. A peacock's feathers grant no environmental advantage. In fact, they're pure downside. The massive fan is cumbersome. It both slows the bird down and makes it easier to get spotted by predators. Shouldn't all of the peacocks who evolved in this direction have died? No, because environmental selection is not the only factor in evolution. The feathers on the male peacock do something very important. It signals to the lady peacocks just how good this male is at survival. He's saying that he's so good, that he's such a great survivor, that he can carry this massive handicap around with him and still beat the competition. The feathers are not a disability. They're to give everyone else a chance. The females respond to this and choose him over his lesser endowed competitors. This is sexual selection, and sex selects for absurdity. Men and women do this with their fashion. They both intentionally make their fashion impractical to denote just how wealthy, secure, and confident they are. Men wear outlandishly colored suits. Women wear increasingly high-heeled shoes, overcomplicated dresses, and never have pockets. The impracticality of fashion is not an accident, it's not an oversight, and it's not a conspiracy. It's the whole point. But where does all this end? Simple. Like most cyclical phenomena, it ends in a crash. There are extreme cases where fashion can do serious harm to its wearer's function. Both men and women have worn corsets that restricted their breathing. Women in China would bind their feet, making it difficult to walk, and men would even wear makeup. Which isn't as bad as those first two. But bro, what are you doing to yourself? So if history, up until this point, were to have been a grand conspiracy to make an objectively bad work of art into something beautiful, would it work? No. Because the historical is a combination of objective and subjective factors. They can go to war with each other, but the objective will win out in the end. Art serves a function. It depicts and propagates values. If the conspiracy successfully props up art propagating self-sterilization, then all of its adherents will die out in a generation. The objective will have taken its revenge. This is not only a human phenomenon, it plays out in nature. Remember how environmental selection wasn't the only way a species goes extinct? Yeah, well, sexual selection can end species too. The Irish elk's horns were once a key part of their mating process, with larger horns granting an advantage in reproduction. The arms race of horn size that this created caused their horns to grow so large that they could no longer escape predators in the forest. The Irish elk is now extinct. Luckily, man does have an advantage over his animal counterparts. We have reason, so we can anticipate these crashes and act accordingly. Although, if we look back at human history, we don't seem to be very good at it. Now that we understand the historical, we can know what makes good fashion. Remember the male peacock. His beauty was a way to signal, or at least to bluff, his status to potential mates. But female peacocks are not the only animals that enjoy their beauty. Man can enjoy it too. Perhaps sexual selection is where our sense of beauty came from. In any case, let's review what fashion is. Fashion is when you try to make people look at you while conveying information about yourself, and are doing both of these things without being gauche. As a signal, fashion must be something that attracts attention. The historical is how you determine the best ways to do this. If your society wears drab clothing, then being less drab or more drab will allow you to better stand out, while being much more colorful or much drabber would be gauche. Just remember that everyone else is trying to do this too, which will cause the society to become more or less colorful over time, forcing you to adjust with them. This is why it's impossible to practice objective fashion. You must approach it historically. Fashion must also communicate information about who you are or what you're trying to become. How fashion communicates specific information is also determined by the historical. Purple was once a way to denote royalty or extreme wealth, but it's far less significant today. More recently, streetwear used to be a display of apathy or poverty, but can now be a way to show off wealth. What is and is not gauche is more obvious here. Trying to dress like a punk today would communicate the desired information, but dressing like a punk from, say, the 16th century would just make you look outrageously idiosyncratic. And finally, there's one last thing you should know about fashion. There's no difference between the way you present yourself to others and the way you are presented to yourself. So even if you don't care about other people, which you probably should, fashion still matters to you. The sayings dress for success or dress for the job you want, not the job you have, may be trite, but they're also true. By adopting the fashion of the person you want to become, you become that person. This makes it all the more important not to be gauche. Gauche fashion not only makes others think less of you, but is also an act of degradation committed against yourself. And that's the aesthetics of fashion. This video was funded by textile moguls and billionaire fashion designers with proceeds from their Malaysian child sweatshops, including Josiah. Subscribe, like, and leave a comment for more. Now get out there and look fabulous.